Why did the laughter stop so suddenly on the rain? A second ago it had been loud, sharp, casual cruelty disguised as humor, men leaning on rifle benches, swapping stories about impossible shots and impossible women. Natalie Voss stood alone at the firing line, her rifle resting forward, the sling snug against her shoulder. Someone had muttered something about ponytails and prayer shots. Someone else laughed too hard. Then the targets came back. 3 rounds, one hole, 800 meters. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if waiting for permission to move again. Natalie didn't look around. She didn't search for faces or reactions. She simply cleared the chamber, laid the rifle down, and exhaled, slow, controlled, the way she always did when something ended, or began. Ethan Cade felt it before he understood it. That tightening in the chest. The old pressure behind the ribs that meant a memory was clawing its way forward. 30 years in naval special warfare had taught him how to read people, but what he'd just seen wasn't luck, and it wasn't talent in the usual sense. It was control, absolute, surgical. And it dragged a ghost up with it. Merrick, his old spotter, breathing too fast. A shot rushed. A half-inch miss. 36 men dead in the counterattack that followed. Ethan folded his arms, more to steady himself than anything else. Across the line, Colin Mercer was already moving. Mercer, square jaw, SEAL pedigree, the kind of man who believed authority followed him like a shadow. His voice cracked through the stillness. No one drills a group like that, not without help. Natalie didn't flinch, didn't argue. She met his stare with calm that made the rest of the range uneasy. "It's just steel and breath," she said. Not a boast, not a challenge, a statement. The phrase landed heavy. Simple words that made the impossible sound inevitable. Ethan watched the crowd shift. Men with rows of combat patches suddenly unsure of their footing. Mercer's agitation wasn't just skepticism, it was fear. Fear that the hierarchy he'd lived by had just tilted. Bore scopes were demanded, gauges brought out, barrels inspected inch by inch. Natalie waited. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hunger, just distance. Like she'd had this argument before, somewhere darker than a sun-bleached range. Ethan felt it then, the unease spreading, the sense that this wasn't about a test anymore. It was a doorway. And he had the sinking feeling that once opened, it wouldn't close again. Who exactly was Natalie Voss? Ethan told himself he didn't need to know. Curiosity was a luxury. Instinct was safer. But hours later, long after the range had emptied, he found himself parked outside a gray, windowless building in Arlington that didn't appear on any directory. The badge slid across the counter read only, "Visitor." No insignia, no unit. Inside, the air felt engineered, odorless, quiet in a way that pressed on the ears. Fluorescent lights hummed over polished floors that reflected nothing human back at you. At the end of the corridor waited a conference room dressed like a polite interrogation cell. Dr. Marcus Ellery sat alone at the table. "Captain Cade," he said, folding his hands, "you've stepped into something that isn't meant for sunlight." Ethan didn't sit. "That demonstration at Fort Ravenwood," Ellery continued, "wasn't an accident, it was a validation." "Planned?" Ethan asked. Ellery's eyes gave nothing. "We don't recruit talent, we rewrite limits." The words landed harder than any technical briefing. Ethan had heard the rumors: augmented units, neural training, biochemical optimization, but hearing it spoken stripped the mystery bare. A screen lit up behind Ellery, jagged mountains, a deep-cut gorge, patrol markers glowing red. Ibrahim Al-Hadi, financier, recruiter, survivor of 3 drone strikes. "He moves through this valley in 72 hours, Ellery said. "Too deep for UAVs, too fortified for teams. Only a bullet reaches him." Ethan swallowed. At that distance, 3,400 meters. At that range, even the Earth betrayed you. And if she fails? Ellery didn't hesitate. Then the program burns with her. Bootsteps cut across tile. General Ross Talbot entered, ribbons heavy on his chest. Voss is prepping, he said, but Mercer's stirring things up. If he pushes, this mission fractures before it breathes. We need you steady, Cade. We need a witness. Ethan felt the ghost again. Merrick, the miss, the cost. He realized he wasn't there to endorse a program. He was there because he couldn't walk away. What does it mean to watch someone carry a weight you once dropped? The mountains of Shamal Gorge didn't care about redemption. They rose sharp and indifferent, shadows sliding across ancient stone as task force ghosts settled into position. Natalie lay prone in a shallow hollow, the rifle an extension of her body. Below, the valley stretched wide and hostile. Every breath tasted like grit. 3 days of insertion, a night flight, goat trails that tore skin from shoulders, and now this, waiting for a man who believed distance made him untouchable. Target in 90 seconds, came the whisper. The shot wasn't just long, it was insane. Crosswinds clawed through the gorge, mirage danced, even curvature demanded its due. Ethan watched Natalie, no tremor, no wasted motion. She wasn't nervous. She was burdened. The convoy appeared, dust, armed escorts, the black SUV in the center. There, Ethan murmured. She didn't respond. Then the radio crackled, wrong tone, urgent, encrypted. We're burned, hostile patrol inbound, compromised. The word hit like shrapnel. Extraction was an hour out. Talbot's voice cut in, cold and final. She takes the shot, mission priority. Ethan leaned close. Natalie, if you don't fire now. I won't miss, she said quietly. The gorge seemed to hold its breath. She exhaled. The rifle cracked. The bullet arrived before sound. Through her scope, Natalie saw the window bloom, saw Al-Hadi's head snap back, then still. 3,400 meters. History shifted. Gunfire erupted, the gorge screamed back. Ghost moved, bounding, suppressing, bleeding. Natalie stayed last, calm even as tracers stitched stone around her. She slung the rifle, lifted her carbine, and moved like someone who'd carried weapons through ambushes long before anyone knew her name. Then voices came over comms, friendly call signs. Mercer's team. Bloodied firing, accusations forgotten. Extraction thundered in, ropes dropped, rotor wash tore the valley apart. Ethan shoved Natalie onto the line, climbed after her under fire. When the ground finally fell away, silence filled the cabin. The mission was complete. But no one spoke. What happens after the impossible becomes real? Days later, in a secure facility, the brass spoke of doctrine and validation, of records broken and futures rewritten. Natalie stood quietly through it all. When she passed Ethan afterward, he saw it, the absence of triumph, the weight. Not pride. Responsibility. Years would pass, myths would grow, the shot would become legend. But those who were there remembered the silence after. The question that lingered. What does it cost to make war less human? Ethan carried his answer quietly. Redemption doesn't erase ghosts. It honors them. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did Ethan Cade feel like he'd already crossed a line the moment the elevator doors closed? The descent was smooth, silent, and far too long for a building that supposedly ended 3 floors below street level. The numbers didn't change. There were no indicators at all, just brushed steel walls reflecting a version of himself that looked older than it had that morning. He told himself this was just curiosity, professional instinct. But the tightness in his chest said otherwise. This felt like the start of something that didn't come with an exit briefing. When the doors finally opened, the air changed. Cooler, thinner, sterile in a way that stripped the sense of time from you. No windows, no clocks, just a corridor that seemed to narrow the farther it went, as if the building itself was discouraging forward motion. Ethan stepped out anyway. Two guards stood at the end of the hall, not ceremonial, not intimidating, just present, the kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself. One scanned his badge. The other studied his face, eyes lingering half a second too long, as if committing him to memory. "Follow the light," the guard said. It wasn't a figure of speech. Thin white strips embedded in the floor pulsed on, one after another, guiding Ethan deeper into the structure. Each step felt deliberate, like he was being measured not just for compliance, but for intention. He wondered, not for the first time, what Natalie Voss had felt walking into places like this. Whether the calm she carried on the range was born here, or forged somewhere worse. The conference room was smaller than he expected. No flags, no unit insignia, just a table, 3 chairs, and a wall that looked solid until it was. Dr. Marcus Ellery was already seated. "You're early," Ellery said mildly. "I didn't want to change my mind," Ethan replied. Ellery's lips twitched, almost a smile. Most people don't realize they've changed it until much later. Ethan didn't sit. "You said Fort Ravenwood was a validation. That implies a process." "Yes." "A program." "Yes." "And Natalie Voss is what? A prototype?" Ellery didn't answer immediately. He stood, walked to the wall, and pressed his palm against it. The surface shimmered, then dissolved into a display of slow-moving data, biometrics, neural maps, ballistic curves overlaid with human silhouettes. "Captain Cade," Ellery said, "tell me, at what point does training end and transformation begin?" Ethan stared at the wall. "When the cost stops being voluntary." Ellery nodded, as if he'd expected that. Natalie volunteered. For what? For the chance to matter in a way that couldn't be ignored. The words landed heavier than Ethan expected. He thought of her on the range. The way she'd stood alone, absorbing ridicule without reacting. How familiar that posture had felt. "Where did you find her?" Ethan asked. Ellery's gaze shifted just slightly. "She found us." The display changed. A younger Natalie appeared. No rifle, no uniform, just a woman standing in the rain outside a nondescript federal building, hands shaking, not from fear but from restraint. Security footage followed. Interviews. Psychological assessments marked inconclusive again and again. "She washed out of 2 conventional pipelines," Ellery said. "Not for lack of skill, for incompatibility." Incompatibility with what? With being underestimated. Ethan frowned. "That's not a diagnosis." "No," Ellery agreed. "It's a pattern." The footage jumped. Natalie at a civilian range, shooting alone at dawn. Natalie hiking high-altitude terrain with weighted packs long after her instructors had called it. Natalie in a hospital room, staring at a consent form longer than most people stared at wedding vows. "What did you do to her?" Ethan asked quietly. Ellery turned back to him. "We didn't make her something else. We removed the noise, fear responses that didn't serve her, limits imposed by expectation. We refined what was already there." "And the cost?" Ethan pressed. Ellery met his eyes. "You of all people know there's always a cost." The wall went dark. A door opened behind Ethan. General Talbot entered without ceremony. "We don't have much time," he said. "Mercer filed a formal complaint. He's demanding oversight. Wants Voss benched until an inquiry clears." "And if it does?" Ethan asked. Talbot's jaw tightened. "Then this entire effort gets dragged into daylight, and daylight is where programs like this die." Ethan thought of the men on the range, the laughter, the disbelief, how quickly admiration had turned into suspicion. "Does she know?" Ethan asked. Talbot hesitated. "She knows enough." That answer bothered him more than a lie would have. Later, alone in a narrow observation room, Ethan finally saw Natalie again. She was on a treadmill, moving at a steady, punishing pace. Sweat darkened the collar of her shirt. Electrodes traced her neck and temples. Numbers scrolled across a screen faster than Ethan could follow. She didn't look superhuman. She looked tired, focused, human in a way the data couldn't capture. A technician murmured stats behind him: heart rate control under stress, oxygen efficiency at altitude, neural latency well below baseline. Ethan barely heard any of it. What he saw was the moment Natalie stumbled, just slightly, then corrected herself without breaking stride. The flicker of frustration that crossed her face, gone almost before it formed. Determined, but carrying something heavy. As if sensing him, Natalie glanced toward the glass. Their eyes met. There was no recognition at first, then something shifted, not surprise, not resentment. Understanding. She slowed the treadmill and stepped off, wiped her face with a towel. The technician said something Ethan couldn't hear, but she waved it off and walked toward the observation door. When she entered, the room felt smaller. "You shouldn't be here," she said calmly. "Probably not," Ethan replied. "Then why are you?" He considered lying, found he didn't have the energy. "Because I saw you shoot," he said, "and it brought something back I never dealt with." Natalie studied him. Guilt. "Yes." She nodded as if checking a box. "That's common." "That doesn't bother you?" he asked. "What they're asking of you?" She looked past him at nothing. "It bothers me every day." "Then why stay?" Natalie was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but softer than it had been on the range. "Because if I don't," she said, "someone else will, and they might miss." The answer settled between them, heavy and unavoidable. Ethan realized then that Natalie Voss wasn't chasing records, or validation, or even redemption. She was carrying responsibility no one else wanted. And the worst part, she was doing it silently, because experience had taught her that speaking wouldn't change a thing. As Ethan left the facility hours later, the sky outside had darkened. He felt altered, not informed but implicated. The question that followed him wasn't whether Natalie could make the shot. It was whether anyone had the right to ask her to. And somewhere deep inside, a voice he recognized whispered the truth he'd been avoiding. This mission wouldn't just test her limits. It would test his. What happens when the silence before a mission starts to feel heavier than the mission itself? Natalie Voss felt it long before anyone said the word deploy. It lived in the pauses between briefings, in the way technicians double-checked systems that rarely failed, in how General Talbot stopped using hypotheticals and started speaking in clocks. 72 hours, 48, 24. Time compressed until it felt like it was pressing against her ribs. She welcomed it. Waiting had always been harder than doing. The prep room was dim, carved deep into concrete and quiet enough to hear her own pulse if she focused on it. Her rifle lay disassembled on the table in front of her, every piece aligned with ritual precision. Natalie cleaned each component slowly, deliberately, not because it needed it, but because the act itself anchored her. Steel and breath. She repeated the phrase internally, not as comfort but as calibration. Across the room, Ethan Cade watched without speaking. He'd been assigned as observer, a word that sounded passive until you realized it meant witness, to success, to failure, to consequences no report could soften. "You don't have to stay," Natalie said without looking up. Ethan shifted. "I know. But you are." "Yes." She reassembled the bolt, the metallic click crisp and final. "Why?" He hesitated. She could hear it in the air. "Because once you're out there," he said, "someone should remember who you were before the numbers." That made her pause. Just for a second. Most people didn't ask that question. They didn't want the answer. Before the numbers, she repeated, I was forgettable. Ethan frowned. No one who shoots like you is forgettable. That's now, she replied. Before, I was the woman people talked over in briefings, the one they assumed would wash out again. She set the rifle aside and finally met his eyes. There was no bitterness there, just honesty worn smooth by repetition. I didn't start this because I wanted to be exceptional, she continued. I started it because I was tired of being invisible. Ethan absorbed that quietly. He thought of Mercer, of the laughter on the range, of how invisibility could harden into armor or hollow you out entirely. Later, alone in the medical bay, Natalie sat while a technician adjusted her sensors. Adhesive pads pressed against skin, cold gel, monitors flickering to life. Vitals stable, the tech said, stress markers nominal. Natalie almost smiled at that. Stress was relative. What she felt wasn't panic. It was gravity. The awareness that what she carried wasn't just a rifle or a mission, but a line that once crossed couldn't be uncrossed. When the tech left, the room fell quiet. Too quiet. Natalie leaned back and closed her eyes. Memory surfaced uninvited. A qualification run she'd finished top of her class, then watched a man receive the praise, an instructor telling her she was good but not right for this community. The long drive home afterward, hands clenched on the steering wheel, wondering if persistence was courage or just stubbornness dressed up nicely. She remembered the day she'd signed Ellery's consent form. Not the words, the feeling. Relief. Because at least then the rules were honest, the expectations clear, no pretending the ceiling didn't exist. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Ellery entered, tablet tucked under his arm. You're within all parameters, he said. Natalie opened her eyes. That's not why you're here. No, he admitted. I wanted to ask if you had questions. She considered that. If I do, would you answer them? He met her gaze, truthfully, no, carefully. Then I don't have questions, she said. I have conditions. Ellery raised an eyebrow. If this works, Natalie said, you don't turn it into a production line. You don't pretend anyone can be shaped into this just because I survived it. Ellery was quiet for a long moment. You don't believe this is survivable. I believe it's survivable for me, she replied. That's not the same thing. He nodded slowly. I can't promise that. I didn't ask for a promise, Natalie said. I asked you to remember. Ellery left without answering, which was answer enough. The night before insertion, Ethan found Natalie alone outside the facility, standing beneath a washed-out sky. No stars, just cloud cover glowing faintly from the city beyond the perimeter. Can't sleep, he asked. She shook her head, didn't try. They stood in silence for a while, the kind that didn't demand filling. Do you ever think about the ones you didn't save? Natalie asked. Ethan's breath caught. Every day. She nodded, me too. That surprised him. You haven't. Not like you, she said, but I've watched people fail because someone decided they weren't worth backing. I've been that person. She turned to him then. Tomorrow if something goes wrong. It won't, he said reflexively. She smiled faintly. If it does, I need you to do one thing. What? Tell them I chose this, she said. Not because I was built, but because I was willing. Ethan swallowed. I will. Insertion began at 200. The Blackhawk lifted cleanly, rotors slicing the night into pieces. Natalie sat strapped in, eyes closed, hands resting lightly on her rifle case. Around her, Ghost moved with practiced economy. No bravado, no last-minute jokes. Just focus. As the terrain below shifted from grid to shadowed ridgeline, Natalie felt the familiar narrowing, the world compressing into essentials. Breath, balance, time. She wasn't afraid of the shot. She was afraid of what came after. Because records fade, missions blur, but proof reshapes expectation, and expectation could be weaponized as easily as a rifle. When the helicopter banked toward the drop zone, Ethan leaned close. "For what it's worth," he said over the engine noise, "you're not invisible anymore." Natalie opened her eyes. "I know," she said, "that's what scares me." The light went green. They moved. And somewhere far below, in a gorge that didn't care about fairness or history, the conditions were already aligning. Wind shifting, heat rising, distance waiting to be challenged. Natalie Voss stepped into the dark, carrying more than a mission. She carried the quiet hope that if she did this right, if she bore the weight without flinching, then maybe the next woman wouldn't have to prove she belonged by doing the impossible. And if that hope was naive, she would carry that too. Because some burdens aren't assigned. They're accepted. What does the world sound like when everything depends on a single breath? For Natalie Voss, it sounded like nothing at all. The mountains swallowed noise. Wind moved, but it didn't howl. Stones shifted under boots, but the sound never traveled far. Even the team's breathing felt muted, as if the gorge itself were listening and had decided to wait. They had been in position for hours. Not the dramatic kind of hours people imagine. No countdown clocks, no swelling music, just stillness stretched thin enough to hurt. Natalie lay prone in a shallow cradle of rock, her body aligned behind the rifle with the familiarity of muscle memory earned the hard way. She didn't think about the distance anymore. Thinking invited doubt. She thought about process. Breath in. Pause. Breath out. Ethan Cade crouched a few feet behind her, binoculars pressed to his face. He'd learned long ago that impatience killed faster than bullets. Still, his jaw tightened every time the wind shifted. At this range, a whisper mattered. Below them the valley shimmered with heat. The convoy would come. Intel was solid. It always was until it was. Natalie adjusted a fraction of a mil, then stilled. Her mind drifted, not forward but backward. She remembered her first long-range failure. Not the miss itself, but the aftermath. The silence. The way the instructor had looked at her, disappointed but unsurprised, as if the outcome had confirmed something he already believed. She had learned then that people rarely remembered the conditions, only the result. Target window opening, the comms operator whispered. Natalie's focus snapped back. The world narrowed to glass and math and patience. The convoy appeared like a rumor becoming real. Dust first, then movement. Armed escorts scanning ridgelines they believed were empty. At the center, the black SUV rolled steadily, confident in terrain and distance. Ethan exhaled slowly, visual confirmed. Natalie didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her reticle tracked the vehicle with unhurried precision. She cataloged variables automatically: speed, angle, mirage distortion. Each one stacked neatly, ordered, manageable. This was the part she trusted. What she didn't trust was what waited on the other side of success. Minutes stretched. Then the radio crackled. Not the clean, clipped tone of Ghost. Something rushed, encrypted, wrong. The comms operator stiffened. Unscheduled traffic. Directional triangulation suggests hostile movement from the East Ridge. Ethan felt his stomach drop. Say again. QRF closing fast. Natalie's pulse didn't spike. It slowed. Her body did what it always did under pressure, shed everything unnecessary. Talbot's voice cut through moments later, sharp and unmistakable. "You are compromised. Shot window collapsing. Execute immediately." The words carried weight, not urgency, finality. Ethan leaned forward. "Natalie, if we wait." She shook her head slightly, never lifting her eye from the scope. No time. Gunfire echoed faintly from the ridge line. Distant, but approaching. Dust plumes spiraled upward where boots disturbed the slope. This was the part no equation accounted for. Natalie felt something then, not fear but anger, not explosive, focused. At the wind, at the timing, at the fact that even now, the margin for error wasn't hers alone. She adjusted once more. 15 seconds, the comms operator whispered. Ethan's thoughts flashed to Merrick, to the half-inch, to the cost of rushing. He leaned close. You don't owe anyone perfection. Natalie's voice was calm, almost gentle. I know. Her breathing slowed until it barely registered. She pressed the trigger. The rifle's report was sharp, contained, swallowed by stone. Recoil nudged into her shoulder like a familiar hand. Through the scope, she saw the moment stretch. Glass erupted. The man inside jerked, then went still. 3,400 meters. The impossible made ordinary. For half a second, the gorge was quiet. Then it exploded. Automatic fire tore into the rocks above them. Rounds snapped overhead, close enough to feel. Ghost responded instantly, disciplined bursts cutting through dust and chaos. Contact East Ridge. Bounding back. Move. Natalie rolled, slung the rifle, and came up with her carbine in one smooth motion. There was no celebration, no pause. The shot was already behind her. Now came the cost. They moved in practice patterns, leapfrogging through cover that barely deserved the name. Stone chipped. Air cracked. Someone went down hard, cursing through clenched teeth as another operator dragged him clear. Ethan fired until his magazine ran dry, swapped without thinking. Years peeled away. He wasn't observing anymore. He was surviving. Natalie covered their movement with ruthless efficiency. Short bursts, controlled, eyes always tracking the next threat. She felt strangely detached, as if the world had flattened into two dimensions, what mattered and what didn't. And then voices. Friendly call signs. Ethan's head snapped toward the opposite ridge. Another team emerged through the dust. Mercer's team. For a split second, uncertainty flared. Accusations, investigations, the threat of everything unraveling. Then Mercer opened fire, covering Ghost's withdrawal without hesitation. No words, no explanations. Just action. The line blurred. Loyalty and secrecy tangled in the roar of gunfire. Whatever Mercer had believed before didn't matter now. What mattered was that he hadn't let the mission die. Extraction came in low and fast. Blackhawks punching through the air, rotors tearing the gorge open. Ropes dropped. Wounded first, someone shouted. Natalie took position at the edge, firing until her last teammate was on the line. Tracers stitched the rock around her, close enough to spark. Ethan grabbed her shoulder. Go. She clipped in and climbed, muscles burning, world narrowing again. At the top, hands hauled her into the cabin. Ethan followed seconds later, breath ragged, arms slick with blood that wasn't his. As the helicopter pulled away, the gorge fell back into silence. Inside the aircraft, no one spoke. The mission was over. But no one felt victorious. Natalie sat strapped in, helmet resting against the bulkhead. Her hands were steady, too steady. She stared at them as if expecting to find something missing. Ethan watched her from across the cabin. You okay? He asked finally. She considered the question. I don't know yet. That was the most honest answer she could give. Back at the facility days later, the world tried to turn the mission into something neat. Reports, metrics, a record circled in red. But when Natalie stood alone in a locker room, peeling off dust-stiffened gear, none of that followed her inside. What followed her was the moment after the shot. The silence. The knowledge that she had changed something fundamental, and that there was no unchanging it. Ethan found her there, sitting on a bench, elbows on knees. They're calling it a breakthrough, he said quietly. She nodded. They would. You saved lives. I ended one, she replied. Not bitter, just precise. He sat beside her. Both can be true. Natalie stared at the floor. That's what scares me. Because somewhere beyond commendations and classified briefings, she understood the deeper consequence. The bar had moved. And once it moved, it wouldn't stop asking more of the people who came next. She didn't regret the shot. But she wondered, briefly, painfully, whether carrying the impossible was something anyone should have to do alone. The answer didn't come. Only the quiet certainty that from this point forward, silence would follow her wherever she went. Not the silence of being ignored. The heavier kind. The kind that waits after the world has seen what you can do. What happens after the world decides you are no longer allowed to be ordinary? Natalie Voss learned the answer in fragments. It arrived in quiet hallways where conversations stopped when she passed, in briefings where her name came with a pause, as if people were recalibrating how to speak around it, in the way technicians handled her equipment with reverence instead of routine. The shot had traveled farther than the bullet. Ethan Cade noticed it too, the subtle shift, the way success hardened into expectation almost overnight. Records were being rewritten in dry language, but beneath the paperwork was something sharper, a hunger. If one impossible thing could be done, why not another? Natalie felt it most during evaluation. She sat alone in a white room while data scrolled across glass walls. Heart rate curves, neural response times, environmental tolerance thresholds. Each line reduced her further into something measurable. Do you feel different? A voice asked through the speaker. Yes, she said. How? She considered lying. Heavier. The voice paused, then moved on to the next question. Between sessions, Natalie found herself drawn back to the range, not the public one, a smaller, forgotten strip of land where no one watched. She shot alone at dawn just as she had before any of this. Same rifle, same routine. The rounds landed where they always had. Perfect. And somehow that scared her more than a miss would have. Because it meant the shot hadn't taken anything from her. Which meant it could be asked again. Mercer requested the meeting. The message surprised everyone, especially Natalie, especially Ethan. They met in a narrow conference room that smelled faintly of cleaning solvent and old coffee. Mercer looked different without the range full of witnesses. Older, quieter. I was wrong, he said without preamble. Natalie waited. She'd learned patience early. I thought you were a liability, Mercer continued. Thought the program was smoke and mirrors, but you held when it counted. That doesn't make it right, Natalie said. No, he agreed. It just makes it true. Ethan watched the exchange carefully. Mercer wasn't apologizing for his doubt. He was apologizing for what it represented. They're going to use this, Mercer said. Push it, scale it. Natalie met his gaze. I know. Mercer exhaled. I came to ask what you want. The question hung there fragile. Natalie had been asked many things in her life. What she could do, what she'd endure, what she'd prove. What she wanted was new. I want it documented, she said finally. Not the numbers, the cost, the recovery time, the limits, all of it. Mercer nodded slowly. You think that will slow them down? No, Natalie said, but it might stop them from pretending it's free. After Mercer left, Ethan stayed behind. You didn't tell him everything, he said. She shook her head. Some things aren't mine to share. Like the night she woke with her jaw clenched so tight it ached. Like the way her hands sometimes hesitated before settling into position, as if remembering something her mind hadn't caught up to yet. Like the fear that one day, the weight would arrive all at once. Publicly, the mission never happened. Privately, it changed everything. Natalie was reassigned, not sidelined but repositioned. Advisory roles, training simulations, classified briefings where her presence alone altered the tone of the room. She spoke rarely. When she did, people listened. Not because she was louder, because she'd paid for the right to be heard. Ethan prepared to leave weeks later, his role as witness complete, at least on paper. On his last day, he found Natalie in the gym, moving through a slow stretch routine. "Going back out?" she asked. "Yes." "You'll tell them," she said. "The truth," he replied, "as much of it as they'll allow." She nodded. "That's all anyone can do." He hesitated. "Do you regret it?" Natalie considered the question longer than most. "I regret that it was necessary," she said. "I don't regret doing it." That distinction mattered. As Ethan walked away, he realized she wasn't staying because she wanted more missions. She was staying to guard the line she'd helped redraw. Weeks later, Natalie stood in a briefing room as a younger operator presented a proposed long-range engagement. The numbers were ambitious, the confidence familiar. When it was her turn to speak, the room stilled. "Capability isn't permission," she said quietly. "Just because something can be done doesn't mean it should be expected." A pause. "Plan for failure," she continued. "Protect the people carrying the shot, and remember, records don't bleed, people do." No one argued. Not because they agreed completely, but because they understood she was speaking from a place none of them wanted to reach. That night, alone in her quarters, Natalie removed her rifle from its case and cleaned it slowly. The ritual grounded her, steel and breath. She thought about the woman she'd been, the one standing alone on a range, absorbing laughter. She thought about the woman she was now, no longer invisible but no longer untouched. The world had decided she wasn't allowed to be ordinary. She accepted that, but she refused to be used quietly. Because strength, she had learned, wasn't just about carrying weight. It was about deciding how it was carried. And sometimes, the most important shot isn't the one that ends a life. It's the one that draws a line. What remains when the echoes fade and the world moves on. Natalie Voss found out slowly. There was no ceremony for the end of Task Force Ghost, no final briefing that acknowledged what it had been or what it had cost. Programs like that didn't end, they dissolved, reassigned personnel, reclassified documents, a careful scattering of people and proof so no single place held the whole truth anymore. Natalie stayed. Not because she was ordered to, because leaving felt like abandonment. Months passed, then years. The headlines found other stories, new crises, new names. The record stood, but it gathered dust, referenced quietly in closed rooms by people who hadn't been there and never would be. Natalie became something difficult to define. Not a legend, not a weapon, not a warning. A reference point. Young operators were sent to her with careful language, not to replicate what she'd done but to understand it. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, she chose words like tools, simple, heavy, designed to be used carefully. Ethan Cade visited once more, before retiring for good. They walked along the edge of a range at dusk, the sun sinking low enough to turn everything gold and indistinct. Targets stood empty downrange, silhouettes without context. "You could have disappeared," Ethan said. "Taken a contract, cashed out, let them mythologize you." Natalie watched the light fade. "I thought about it." "What stopped you?" She considered the question. "If I left, the story would belong to them. I wanted it to belong to the people who carry it next." Ethan nodded. He understood that kind of responsibility now, the kind that didn't come with rank or recognition. "Do you ever wish you hadn't taken the shot?" he asked. Natalie didn't answer right away. She remembered the gorge, the wind, the moment after. She remembered the silence that followed her ever since, not isolation but awareness. The knowledge that what she'd done couldn't be undone, only contextualized. "No," she said finally, "but I wish the world understood that it wasn't the point." Ethan smiled faintly. "Most never do." They stood together until the range lights clicked on, one by one. Later, alone, Natalie returned to the small locker she'd kept unchanged all these years. Same bench, same metal smell. She removed her rifle and laid it across her knees, running a cloth along the barrel with practiced care. Steel and breath. The phrase had carried her through ridicule, through impossible expectation, through silence both earned and imposed. It wasn't a mantra anymore. It was a reminder. That tools mattered. That breath mattered. That the person behind both mattered most of all. She thought about the laughter on the range that first day, how it hadn't broken her, but how easily it could have, how many others it already had. She thought about the young woman who'd approached her weeks earlier, eyes bright with ambition and fear. "They say you're the reason the ceiling moved," the woman had said. Natalie had shaken her head. "Ceilings don't move, people do." "What if I can't do what you did?" "Good," Natalie replied. "You shouldn't have to." That night, Natalie stepped outside and looked up at a sky finally clear enough to show stars. They felt farther away than they used to. Or maybe she'd changed the way she measured distance. She wasn't proud of the record. She was proud of what she'd protected. The restraint she'd argued for. The caution she'd insisted on. The reminder she kept offering, again and again, that war didn't become cleaner just because it became quieter. In time, her role diminished. New voices took over. New debates replaced old ones. Natalie welcomed it. Nothing weighed more than being the last word. On her final day, she left without announcement. No speech, no handshake line, just a signed clearance form and a nod to the guard who didn't recognize her. She drove until the facility was a dot in the mirror, then gone entirely. Somewhere far away, a range waited, quiet, unremarkable, honest. Natalie unpacked her rifle one last time and fired a few rounds into paper. No spotters, no observers, just wind and breath and distance that no longer needed conquering. The shots were good, but that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that she could still choose when to pull the trigger and when not to. Because the truth she'd learned, the one no metric could capture, was simple and enduring. Strength isn't proven by how far you can reach. It's proven by how carefully you decide to. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And long after the echoes fade, that quiet choice is what remains.